All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Colin Damude and with M-Level, and I am excited to host the next up in our expert webinar series with Peter Talmers of Slalom Consulting and Jordan Fladell, CEO of M-Level. And just to let you know that next up in our expert webinar series will be April 12th, and everyone will get the recording as well as a PDF of the slides today. So if you happen to miss something, you'll be able to review those. And we've still got quite a few people joining, but I want to go ahead and get the webinar started because Peter has got some great content for us. And let me just introduce Jordan Fladell, CEO of M-Level, who can get us kicked off. Jordan?
Yeah, well, thank you, Colin, and thanks to everybody again for making time on a Tuesday to join us for the next series in our webinar series here at M-Level. Today we have a great guest for you all. We have Peter Talmers, who's a solution principal at the Slalom Chicago office. For those who don't know, Slalom is a consulting firm that helps companies solve business problems and build for the future. Their solutions span business advisory, customer experience, technology, and analytics, and they have over 25 offices across the U.S., U.K., and Canada. Peter himself is an expert in organizational effectiveness and talent transformation. His recent work using behavioral economics and learning sciences to improve employee experience, innovation, and business performance. He's the author of several white papers and articles on learning, including on today's topic, lean learning. And I can't tell you how personally I am excited today that we are covering this topic. I still remember in the early days of 2011 and 12 when lean learning was taking off in its initial phases at Slalom. So excited to have Peter join us. And Peter, I will turn the floor over to you because I know the audience came today to hear all about lean learning and your thoughts that you represent on behalf of Slalom. So welcome to the M-Level webinar series.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jordan. And hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining and taking time out of your day. Really excited to talk about lean learning and how learning is evolving in the 21st century. My hope is that you walk away from today with a few big ideas and that you can focus on and apply tomorrow, or maybe even this afternoon at work. And I'll make two commitments to you during our time today. One is I'll do my best to make this interesting. The second is to make it useful. I'd like you to walk away with some specific examples as well as some macro level principles that you can apply to your work. And the last thing is I would like to make this interactive. So feel free to use the chat function. Feel free to jump in anytime, ask a question, offer a challenge, make a statement, whatever you like. A question for everybody. As we think about 21st century learning, how are you all seeing the learning needs change since we sort of entered this new millennium? You can just type your answers into the chat window. Anything that you're seeing in terms of what's different than it was 20 years ago. Some of you may not have been in the field that long, that's fine. But just curious to hear in the last several years, what do you notice is different? And we see a bunch of things coming in here. Real-time, attention spans, micro-learning, speed of change, more interaction as an expectation, absolutely, speed of learning transfer, great comments. On the job, less ILT, huge volume of information, gamification, just in time. Great comments, everyone. Thank you. Absolutely. I think we're going to hit on many of these themes as we go through, but I appreciate you sharing kind of what you're seeing. And we'll be asking some more questions later on. So just briefly how we're going to structure our time, 4 big topics. First, talk about trends. What's changing in the learning space? Second, what should L&D do as a result of all these changes and trends? Third, some tactical case studies. And then lastly, what's next? Where do we go from here? So what is changing in the world of learning and development? I guess there are 3 kind of big things I want to highlight. And the summary is a lot. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of opportunity. The first, just to anchor us and remind us, learning is a giant industry. You'll see it's $150 billion a year in the U.S. alone, more than double that globally. And there's a lot of dollars being spent into it. And I think one of the opportunities is how do we make those dollars be more impactful? How can we drive more change? The second thing is kind of the challenge. The L&D has a bit of a mixed reputation. Some research from the Corporate Executive Board found that nearly 80% of business leaders like L&D interventions and trainings and experiences. They actually have a positive reaction. But when you push them a little further and say, are these critical to achieving business outcomes? Most of them, almost 75%, say that they're not. And some of the customer experience feedback in terms of Net Promoter Score, this one was particularly low, 31, others negative 31, others have been -8. There's some that are a little more positive, but if plus 50 is considered, really, really good, overall as an industry, we're not there yet. And I think that's a real opportunity for us. Why is this happening? We could spend a whole webinar on this, and I'll just offer a couple quick thoughts on why. One is there is so much content out there, and we as learning professionals feel that we have to, quote, cover it all the time. The challenge is that people can't quite take all of that in, and so the impact isn't always what it could be. The second is L&D is not always, but frequently still viewed as sort of isolated, separate from the business, not having a seat at the table, and so on. One colleague even said that L&D is less a department than a compartment. It feels very, very on its own. The third one is maybe a little more controversial, and again varies, but sometimes learning is not taken as seriously as other functions. And so the accountability isn't always there. If you're in sales and you're not achieving results, there are clear consequences to that. In learning, it's sort of like, well, could you sort of change it up for next time? And I think part of that comes from an expectation that learning will only get us so far. So those are a few thoughts. I know there are many, many more, but there's even more change that's coming that's going to drive further opportunity for everyone. And that is three big forces of disruption: technology, demography, and science. Technology is probably not a surprise. Automation, augmentation, digitization are all things that are happening. So automation of work, as tasks become performed more and more by technology, that means what's left for people to do? Oh, they have to continuously learn something else. So that's driving some focus around continuous learning. Second is augmentation. So augmented reality is still in its early stages, but seems to be showing more promise in virtual reality in terms of blending technology and humans together in performing. Digital technology has certainly wired up everybody and connected us. So technology is driving a lot of change and a lot of hope. The second is demographics. Boomers are beginning to retire now. Those in the workforce are looking for more meaning, purpose, opportunity, wanting to give back, share what they have learned with others. Millennials are coming, hungry to learn, hungry to grow. And as new skills are required, many of the skills people have had, they have to let go of and adopt some new things. So that's driving an opportunity. Finally, and in some ways maybe the most profound is science. Learning science is coming into its own. It hasn't really been a thing for a long time. People have heard of kind of social science or natural sciences, life sciences. What is learning science? Well, it's really cognitive science, behavioral science, neuroscience, how the brain learns. We are now being able to take data and evidence for what optimizes the speed and depth of learning and memory and performance in a way that we haven't really before. So rather than being something that is just based on tradition and what we kind of were used to growing up or in our previous job, now science and data and evidence-based practices are being brought to the table. And that's certainly not only in corporate L&D, but in public education more broadly in universities. So a lot of excitement and opportunity there. What does this mean? What this means, though, is there's so much going on, kind of creating a lot of whitewater, and it's causing a problem. We call it the 2120 problem. And this is facing 21st century challenges with 20th century thinking. If you take a second to look at these two icons here, they were very deliberately chosen. The first is a traditional organization chart. So you sort of have a boss at the top and then workers underneath that. This is the mental model of the industrial age. This is what the 20th century was all about. Sort of comes from Frederick Winslow Taylor, scientific management. And maybe the biggest metaphor is a factory or a manufacturing plant. You have raw materials come as input, put them on an assembly line, do some things to them, and then you spit out widgets or products or whatever it might be. And this is the way most organizations ran for many years. But over the last couple decades, that has changed a lot. And our current reality in the 21st century is much more like a network. But not only a digital network, but more like a social network, a living network. The metaphor for business for many years used words like, firing on all cylinders or a well-oiled machine. We don't hear those metaphors used as much anymore because that model of reality doesn't match business today. Things are much more connected, interdependent, more complex. Some of you may have heard the VUCA metaphor that the military made popular: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. That's kind of the environment that we're facing. Some of you may be familiar with what the military's done in this space. Team of Teams is a popular book around how we had to change how the military operated in Iraq to fight terrorism. And the short answer is it looks a lot more like the right-hand side than the left-hand side. So anyway, this mismatch is causing a lot of tension in organizations. And the question is, well, what does this mean if you're inside a company? And what it means is that the nature of work is changing. The old model was built on efficiency, on hierarchy, on mass production, on the idea that knowledge is power, and the command and control model with a heroic leader. Well, today, we're much more in an environment where we operate with a lot of uncertainty, and you have to adapt. And instead of a hierarchy, we have a wirarchy, where everything's interconnected. Instead of mass production, we have mass collaboration. Just think of Wikipedia. How did that happen? It wasn't by a bunch of smart people in a room. It was by smart people all over the world who are passionate. And instead of knowledge being power, sharing is power. So the idea is of distributed leadership, not top-down. And those of you who have seen some of the TED Talk by Sir Ken Robinson on sort of the learning revolution, he talks about not command and control is what drives performance, but climate control. So it's creating the conditions, the culture, the environment, so that people can learn and be at their best. And so learning is a lot about not just delivering content, which is sort of the widget factory view, but more about creating conditions for learning to happen. It's more the idea that you have soil, and although you throw seeds on it, if it's thrown on sand, they're not going to grow very well. But if they're in rich, fertile soil that's cultivated, then, boy, you're going to get a lot of growth and development and learning. So this is a little bit about the shift. So what does this mean then for people working inside organizations? And this is most of the audience that we support as learning practitioners. What this new environment means is two big things. One is people tend to feel overwhelmed. And there was an article in HBR probably 10 or 15 years ago even by an ADD expert. And it was actually called Why Smart People Underperform. So I sort of borrowed that here. And he said it's not that they're bad themselves, but they actually have environmentally induced ADD or ADHD. And that comes from hyperconnection. It's even more true today than it was 10 years ago. Information overload, change fatigue, a lot of uncertainty. And so some people are thrashing. They're like, oh my gosh, where do I focus? And what they end up focusing on is the thing that's buzzing in front of their face at the last second. So that's one state of our learners. The second is, what this means for people is the shift in skills. Because if you were on an assembly line, you could just screw in your bolt into the widget as it went in front of you and then wait for the next one. But today, you're working inside a network, a living network, a social network, where teaming matters more than anything else. And what is teamwork based on? Trust, safety, listening, reciprocal behavior, reciprocity. And so this is a shift from human capital, which is having skilled people, to social capital, which is having skilled people working together. We hear a lot about the gig economy, for example. if you're working, plugging in and plugging out of projects all the time, the ability to work with others is becoming more and more important. In fact, there was a report about a month ago that came out by the National Bureau for Economic Research, and all these economists said, you know what, in the labor market, social skills are now becoming far more valuable than just traditional cognitive skills of analyzing and deciding. So working with others is a big shift. So that raises the big question now, given all that kind of context, how should L&D respond? What should we do as learning practitioners to help our organizations and our people? So I want to throw out another question here that will seem a little bit off mark, but I think we'll be able to weave it back in. I want you to think about what are 2 or 3 things you did as a child, and just enter them in the chat box. Could have been a sport that you played, or you're involved with performance or music, or something in a community group, a club, some sort of activity that you went to, your parents had to drive you. All right, baseball, piano, soccer, sports, softball, orchestra, 4-H, wrestling, chess, band, hiking, ceramics, piano, Spanish, student council. This is awesome. Well, the thing I love about asking this question, there's so many interesting things that people do. And of course, running around with friends, a key skill as a kid. Love it. Okay, so now as you think about whatever answers you threw out there, I want to ask you a follow-up question. How did you improve at those things? Whatever your activity was, how did you get better at it? What were the activities you engaged in? Practice, learning from others, practice, 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 experience, repeat, practice, coaching, doing more of it, consistency, making it fun, listening, playground, practice as a team. Love that. Watching others. Okay, so to me, what I would kind of boldly offer is we sort of know the answer to 20th century learning, which is everything that everyone just put there. The number one thing I get back when I ask this question to many different groups is practice and coaching and repetition. And if I apply that filter to L&D organizations around the world that we've had a chance to work with, it's really interesting that is not the centerpiece of most learning strategies. The centerpiece of most learning strategies is content delivery. And I think that's a really interesting point to just pause and reflect on. What is it that is driving us to believe that distributing content drives, learning, when we reflect on our own experience, it's usually practice, repetition, coaching, things like that. Now, in fairness, I think there's definitely a growth and a shift in this direction. 70-20-10 is sort of an example of that. Do more on the job. That's sort of more of an applied, actually, practice. The coaching element from the 20% feedback and from working with others is part of that. So I do think it's showing up. And coaching, manager as coach, or development from the manager is also rising. So I do think we're moving in that direction. But I just want to have everybody, look in the chat box and look at how many times people said practice and repetition, and think about the learning stuff you're involved with. How much focus is L&D putting into designing for practice and repetition and feedback and coaching? So that's just a question to think about. So to answer the question, what should L&D do now? I think a little bit comes from the question and interaction we just had. But the other part is what we call, the title of this webinar, Lean Learning. So what is Lean Learning? And what should L&D do relative to that, given this 21st century environment? There are 3 big principles that I want to share, and then we'll talk about some case study examples that highlight what is Lean Learning. The first thing that Lean Learning is that it's less content, and the idea is that less can be more. So this means in all the learning strategy work that we're doing, prioritize what really drives impact. If you can apply a little bit of data science and learning analytics and find out What are the elements of whatever you're trying to work on that drive the most impact? What explains most of the variance? Focus on those things. Double down there. The second is to focus on apply. Apply. CEB has some neat research that talks about a study they did with, several hundred organizations, and they said those that had 70% of the focus on application outperformed all the others by a big margin. And that goes back to the practice comment that you all made just a second ago with the poll. So prioritize what drives impact, focus on applying, and then forget the rest. This is really hard for us as learning professionals because we're always saying, oh, well, we want to make sure we get to this, make sure we tell them about that, we want to make sure we, quote, cover that. The problem is in today's day and age, people are overwhelmed by that volume of information. They just can't remember it all. So let's not put that stress on ourselves. We can get to more later, but prioritizing, applying, and then forgetting the rest can be really helpful. Here's an example of that. A call center. Many of them frequently have high turnover. And one practice that's really, really helpful is top 10 call types. So when you join, your focus for the first several weeks is to master the top 10 call types that you're going to get. It's sort of applying a Pareto, 80-20 rule to learning, saying focus on the dominant stuff you're going to get, master that, and over time, guess what happens? You're going to bump into other things. So you're actually going to learn even more than that top 10, but at least you'll achieve a sense of mastery around that top 10. And for those of you who are Daniel Pink fans, autonomy, mastery, and purpose, that's a great way to get mastery, is that application and repetition. So that's kind of one idea. One key concept of lean learning is less is more and less content. The second is more context. So more context. So if you think about all that 21st century stuff we talked about, how the VUCA world, speeding up, everything is interconnected, more complex, rapidly changing, that means the context is changing. And so whatever you're working on, whatever you're learning, however you're performing, you have to consistently and constantly be rethinking and recalibrating with that environment so that you can make sure you're pointing yourself in the right direction. The analogy I think about is playing basketball. Playing basketball in the 1900s is sort of the way it's played today, where you move up and down the court doesn't move, the basket doesn't move, the basketball doesn't move, even though people around it does. What's happening today in business is the basketball net is actually moving, and so is the backboard. And what's in and out of bounds is also fuzzier. So imagine playing basketball where you can kind of run out of the lines, maybe run in the stands, and then you're trying to shoot the ball, but the basket is moving. That's a little bit of what's happening today. So rethinking with the environment to understand the context is very, very important. So the ideas here: one, make learning look like work. This is a colleague of mine, Dan Bielenberg, kind of summarized this to me several years ago, and I thought it was just a great way to highlight it. This solves the problem of learning transfer, right? If you're transferring learning, then that takes effort to transfer it from one experience to the other. But the more you make learning look like work, the less load there is on the employee, on the learner, to have to figure out how it applies. The second is to grow sense-making skills, to understand what's going on in the environment. It's not just about getting information to people, but it's making sense of that information. What does that mean now? One of the best, most vocal people on this today is a guy named Julian Stodd out of the UK. He's written a lot about social learning and talks about sense-making. So that's very important. The third is this teaming skills. You have to be able to work with other people because you can't figure out all the context on your own. You have to be understanding it from the environment. Just a quick example of this is in the military and the special forces, special operations. I mentioned Stanley McChrystal and Team of Teams earlier. He talks about this, but the special forces are working into highly uncertain environments that are very volatile. They use something called the OODA loop. It's OODA. in order to figure out how they should act. And those stand for observe, orient, decide, and act. So they're walking into a situation, they observe what's happening. Second, they orient to themselves versus the environment. What does that mean to me? That's all this sense making. Then they decide what they're going to do, and then they're going to act. So if we can do more OODA-ing as learning strategists and as building it into our learning experiences, helping people sync to the environment, that is very, very useful. So that's the second principle. Less content, more context. Now, key concept that I would say is a takeaway is that the shelf life of skills is shrinking. Okay, with the pace of change, technology, and so on, the skills that we have today aren't going to be the ones we had tomorrow. And remember, iPads are only like a decade old. Twitter, the same thing. Many computer languages are changing. Even the term like DevOps seems like a quaint term because it was so popular a few years ago, even though it's still around. So we can't predict what's next. So what is the master skill? And the key concept is to learn how to learn. And the little icon there is supposed to be a double helix, a DNA helix. Learning how to learn is like the stem cell of all skills, because learning how to learn is what can help you learn any other skill. And we have to help people do this. The world is changing too fast where L&D can just manufacture all the courses and spit them out there to people. We have to create the environment and the encouragement for people to learn on their own. One example here is there's a great course on Coursera that's called Learning How to Learn. It's taught by Barbara Oakley of Oakland University in outside Detroit in Rochester, Michigan. And it's been incredibly popular, and it's a way to help people learn how to learn. Here we say learning is everything. We're going to get to that point in just a minute. But I really believe that learning is sort of the hidden skill that is central to organizational success going forward. Okay, so given all those things, let's try to apply one of our learning principles, which is that repetition is the mother of learning. So the three big tenets of lean learning are less content, more context, and focus on enabling that key concept. Now, let's get to these cases. I know Colin had been tweeting about them, and I think it's important that we get to some specific examples. So we've got the first one for you here is for a Fortune 500 company, actually a Fortune 200 company. They're in the food service business, and this was with their sales force. They had to learn new products, about 25 new products, 4 times a year. They had a seasonal promotion of foods tied to a season. So like in the fall, they would have pumpkin spice and apple pie and things like that. They had to learn this new set of products and then bring them to their customers and sell them. So the lean learning strategy that we applied had the 3 pieces: less content, more context, and then helping people learn how to learn. And the less content was through a gamified learning solution. It happened to actually be M-level in this case, but the idea was to micro-target what mattered most. So there's a big focus in identifying not attributes and specs of these products. That's actually what we started with, is let's make sure everybody can master all the features and functions of these 25 products. No, we focused on the customer experience and the customer view. What were the benefits to the customer? How does this apply to them? If you run a restaurant and are trying to build a menu, how would you integrate these? What would be the obstacles you'd have to overcome? And we built a series of 3 learning challenges across 6 weeks, and we've kind of made it into a competition. And we encourage people to play these games, these missions. And we also pulled in a practice we have around information management and data analytics. And so they did some statistical analysis of the game plays, which M-level was able to provide on the back end. And we looked at how did salespeople increase their sales based on how much they played the game. And we sort of did a scientific experiment. We had a treatment group and a control group. So the control group got the traditional learning approach. The treatment group got traditional learning plus this gamified lean learning solution. And what we found was that those people who played each mission 13 to 29 times increased their sales by 22.6%, which is the graph you see over on the far right. It's a pretty incredible result. Those who played less than 13 times didn't make enough of an impact to help their sales. Those who played 30 to 100 times, believe it or not, the number was 52% increase in sales. Now, those who played over 100 times actually didn't do very well. And it turns out those might have just been the gamers and loafers that are playing more than they were selling. So there is a balance to this. The other part of this solution, though, that I want to highlight is what it says at the bottom of that first column. Managers were asking questions about how the salespeople were applying this on the job. And so we gave them a one-page talk sheet with questions. It said, hey, when you have a one-on-one weekly touch base with your salesperson, ask them, hey, have you been playing the game? What have you tried? What have you found? What's been hardest? Have you tried anything with a customer? What's been the feedback? Simply asking those questions signaled, oh, I guess this matters. I guess I better be using this. I guess I got to be trying this. And then above that, we had the VPs of sales for the regions around the country asking their district sales managers, hey, what have you found? How's it going? And that was how we created some context and some accountability around the learning. The second thing there around more context was customer conversations. So as I mentioned, the learning missions were targeted for application, not specifications, what this means to a customer. The other concept many of you know from learning science literature is spaced repetition. And when you spread that learning out over time, it actually increases what people learn. There's a social aspect here too. There's a leaderboard, competitive. You can see kind of who's played the game the most, who has the fastest time, the best score. And we even embedded for the winner of each of these three phases of the challenge, the winner salesperson got to make a selfie video, and we embedded that into the next mission. And they said, hey, catch me if you can, or whatever their message was. So that was a little bit of fun competition. Doesn't work with all workforces, but in the sales force, it was certainly something that did. And then the accountability aspect from the management and executives asking about how this is being used. I think too often as learning professionals, we think once we've deployed it and people have access to the content that a miracle occurs, and it doesn't. We have to make the miracle happen by engaging. The final thing around helping people, the key concept of learning how to learn, was that we told people, go test it out, just try it out. This is an experiment. Take the mission, play the game, then go talk to your customer, and then see what helped, see what worked, what didn't. Then give us the feedback so we can incorporate it into the next challenge. And this put them in control of their learning. And they said, you can make this real for yourself. Okay, so this is this first case study. I'll just pause here because I know I've been talking continuously. Is there anything on the chat that we need to respond to? Or if not, we can kind of keep going. Okay. Great. So I'll give you another one, case study that's very different, okay? This was gamified learning, kind of micro-targeting of content. This next one is from another large organization. This is a Fortune 100 financial services company. And the goal was to get people productive faster. This is an organization that had a lot of retirements, had a lot of hires. The learning organization was not able to scale to meet demand. And they said, we have to completely rebuild and rethink how we get our people productive. And so this was about building a new operating model for learning, building in all the learning science that we know, all the trends in technology, and applying a lean learning 70-20-10 approach. So what do we do? Again, the three principles: less content, more context, enable kind of people to learn how to learn. The first thing we did was target the learning goals with a lot of precision. So we found that in this organization, people had been hired and kind of grew through tribal knowledge. They joined a small team as a new hire, and then they were kind of taught on the job, which was great, but at scale, that didn't work. So we said, let's define the 5 core skills you need to be successful in this job, and then let's personalize your learning plan based on that. And what we did is we had manager and employees have a common set of skills. We used a visual that highlighted the skills. They did an assessment on where they felt they needed to grow the most, and they calibrated their expectations on how they were doing on these 5 different skills, and then they built a learning plan. Constant feedback was a hallmark of this strategy, as was a growth mindset. This was actually a couple of years ago, and Carol Dweck's work was really, really hitting its peak with the idea of, a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And we told all the new hires and even the existing employees, when we implemented this new model, we said, hey, we don't expect you to know everything, but we do expect you to learn. We expect you to try to learn, and our commitment to you is that we're going to give you the tools, the encouragement, the conditions, and the focus to be your best. And so we focused much less on seeds of content, learning content, and more on building better soil. We actually felt there wasn't a shortage of information. It was more about creating the conditions in which that information could be used. So that was kind of the first principle. The second is growing a team of leaders, and this is about providing context. We said all the leaders, all the frontline supervisors up to senior vice president, these are the people that can help everyone else understand context. What matters most? So we told the leader, you have to be not just someone who gets business results, but someone who develops people. And we expect you to not only, take the log out of someone else's eye, but also your own. You have to look in the mirror and invest in yourself. You have to make feedback safe, make these conversations supportive, and you have to make the time. We're all busy, but we have to invest. And the chief executive of this organization actually said at the end of the year, he said, looking back, if there's anything that we've learned about our business, is that talent makes the difference. And if we don't invest in ourselves as leaders and in our people and in our teams, the world is going to pass us by. So that was some great context that the leaders helped provide there. The final was to enable a learning ecosystem. For some people, some of our traditional executives, they didn't like that word. It was kind of too, organic for them, a little too tree hugger. So they said, can we just call it an environment instead of an ecosystem? And we said, sure. So we'll call it a work environment, learning environment, where everything should be focused on our one mission. And what is our business purpose? What's our purpose to our customers? And that we learn through relationships, not just through content. And finally, if we apply that sort of gardener model to an ecosystem, we have to seed, feed, and weed these new ways of learning. I mentioned Stanley McChrystal, and for those of you familiar with him, his model of leadership is to lead like a gardener. He said, things are moving too fast for me to figure it out anymore. I just have to be a gardener to create the right conditions. And that's what we did with this organization, is create the culture, the values, the rewards, the encouragement, the nourishment, quite frankly, for people to bloom and thrive. And you'll see some of the business results that we had. We actually measured, we had a series of hypotheses. We said, if we implement these new strategies, then these are the outcomes we'll see. And we saw people moving up the learning curve faster. Managers felt more confident having development conversations because they weren't so used to doing that. And employee satisfaction also went up because they were getting more love from their leaders. So this is a second case study. And I guess the question really comes now to, what is next? What does this mean? Where do we go from here? And again, spaced repetition, less content, more context. Remember the key concept. And what I would say is to, when we get off the call, go to your business partners, go to your teams, and shift the conversation to help people realize how learning is actually the #1 business skill today. Why do I say this? If you think of any big initiative going on in your organization today, my guess is one of these words is involved. We have to become more agile and be more, more greater agility or more adaptive. The second is innovation. It's probably an innovation initiative. Maybe there's a chief innovation officer, or there's some focus on customer innovation. The third is transformation. Transformation, we have to transform our operating model, whatever it might be. Design thinking, human-centered design is sort of a practice that is sometimes tied to that. What I would argue is the overlap in this Venn diagram on the right is that learning is what sits underneath all of those things. Being more agile and moving away from waterfall working, well, that's learning something new. Innovating is learning to do things differently. Transforming is changing to become something better and improved. All of those have learning at their core. But we don't talk about it in that way. And I'm not saying we have to, but I am saying that we have to recognize that, the dark matter in all this business performance is learning. Now, I'm not the first person to say this. In the 1990s, Peter Senge, some of you will remember his famous book, The Fifth Discipline, which was all about becoming a learning organization. He said that many companies were transformed by that. Shell, Hanover Insurance, the whole group of people at MIT focusing on becoming a learning organization. But in some ways, it was like a little bit too early for its time. But now, if you go back and read some of that work, it applies in spades to today. Why? Because all of those predictions around more uncertainty, the world speeding up, are now have achieved scale. Before, they were just beginning in the 90s.
Hey, Peter.
Edwards Deming. Yeah.
As you were going through this learning, something resonated with me, and I'm sorry to interrupt you in the middle of thought there, but one of the common questions we get is where does learning occur? And as you were talking, the concept that it seems like we get this question a lot with the clients or prospects is where does the learning occur? And what I think you're kind of covering on is that learning itself is just my takeaway is that it doesn't occur in a textbook necessarily at all times. It doesn't occur necessarily in a PowerPoint deck or even in a game. It occurs everywhere. And that to have one defined space of where learning should occur is kind of a limitation to succeeding in a time like today. Is that kind of your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, there's a weird assumption that we all have in the back of our heads, which is, okay, well, people need to learn. I guess I better set up a training class and then talk at them for a few hours because that's how it happens. As if your brain is turned off for the other, 35 hours in the week. The brain is on all the time, learning all the time, learning everywhere. And much of the time, we learn most deepest in informal one-off interactions. Why? Because those tend to be safer. And I can really be honest. I can let my hair down. I can let my guard down and say, here's really where I feel stuck or where I'm struggling or where I need help. So absolutely. And I think, to your point, Jordan, that's one of the conversations I would encourage everyone to go have, is how can you have a conversation with your business to help them realize that learning isn't just happening with whatever L&D does or in an experience or an event. It's happening all the time. And I think the opportunity for learning L&D professionals is to say, oh my gosh, that's totally true. We now have to own the business. We have to own the working environment and create the conditions for people to learn all the time whenever they need to. And that's by creating that environment to do it, not just, well, here's my training, I'm going to sort of deliver this to you. Because we can't predict what everybody needs. We just have to make it accessible. So I would absolutely believe or agree with that. That's a real blind spot with many of our colleagues in business, and that's why I feel like learning really has a chance to rise.
I would agree, and I think that takes the courage of just feeling comfortable. Because I think if you're a learning professional, your natural bias is that if I bring up that learning doesn't just occur in a classroom or learning doesn't just occur in a training session or from my content, am I putting myself at risk? In this ecosystem, as I talk to my business partner, when the reality is you're increasing the value that you bring to the table because it likely will bring you to the table, not just take you away from in and out from the table as you're creating that content or doing that classroom session. They'll want you as a partner, not just a delivery engine towards that solution.
Yep. And if you think about, a lot of the work that's being done around networks today, social networks, is that, and the problem of silos inside organizations. You need to have vertical kind of learning, but also horizontal learning. Just like you need to have vertical work, like within your function, within IT, but then horizontal work across different parts of the organization. One alone is not enough. It's not like we totally get rid of the hierarchy and everything is just a big, mishmash of chaos. It's not that. There is a structure still, but it's about blending those, and learning is at that intersection. And I think one point of relief as learning professionals is we can say, you don't have to figure it all out. You can partner with the business to help figure it out. But try running experiments. Ask the business, what do you think they need? And hey, learn more about the business so you can go to them with an idea about how to improve things. And you'll have to pilot things small. Okay, they're not going to take a big risk. But if you can show success with something small, the freedom will open up. Absolutely.
Yeah, and Peter, I think one thing I'll touch on from earlier on in your chat session, you asked a question earlier on about how people learn that skill, that dance skill, that playing outside, with all those different things they did when they were children. And almost, if I were to look at the results, almost 90+% of them talked about practice or repetition being that thing that made them better at that skill set. Yet when we talk to both the business and learning professionals, the budget of practice is not really put in play into the overall training, overall exercise, right? We're often delivering training, and then the expectation is the next moment, the next hour, that person has that expertise leaving that classroom, right? And so, one of the other things I think, you're laying in here is that the concept of creating freedom for comfort for practice, so that a person has that ability to have repetition, so they can take 15 or 20 reps before they have to get on that first phone call of the content that they just learned about, or maybe how to overcome that objection or the new process or how to use new software before they're then put into the show. Imagine if you were that kid growing up and you're just learning how to play basketball, and you didn't even know how to dribble yet. Your coach threw you on the court. Everyone can remember that embarrassing moment when the ball got thrown to you and you started running with it, right? Because you didn't have the confidence to dribble. Right, and so, but what so often happens today, Peter, is we see in the court of the business world, where people get put on the court and they get the ball thrown to them and they just start to run with it when they should be dribbling because they learned in an 8-hour session, and our brains, as you mentioned today, have changed whether we liked it or not. That natural attention deficit disorder has kicked in. So, and maybe some words of wisdom for how do you encourage your fellow learning practitioners to feel comfortable talking about allocating practice time in their overall schedule?
It's a great question. The biggest thing I do is try offering people those two questions that we asked earlier. What'd you do as a kid, and which always gets people smiling, reflecting your childhood and the crazy stuff you did, and then how'd you get better? And everyone knows the answer, but for some reason, there's like this mental wall in our brains that when we say, well, when it comes to corporate learning and development, that means classroom or e-learning, or I have to just get the right content. And we forget that we already know the answer. So what I would say is, if you're a learning practitioner worried about that conversation, ask the business or whoever that your doubter is, how did they learn something? And then say, all right, let's take that model and apply it to work. How could we create more practice, more feedback, that type of thing? Because once they remember that, I find people who typically bought in the idea, oh my gosh, you're right, I just don't need access, I need application, and I have to, get that practice in. And if something's really riding on it too, like if it's truly important that people learn it, you'll find that people will double down on the opportunity for practice. I also wanted to mention, Nancy, I see that you have a question on, do you use iterations of prototypes like Apple software development? I'm really glad you asked that, because the answer is yes. So what we often do is we apply human-centered design, which is very similar to agile software development. It's sort of another word for design thinking, and applying that to learning. And we start with empathy maps, so understanding our audience, whoever those are, and empathizing with where they are. And it sort of goes a step beyond the learning needs assessment. Learning needs is very important to know what are the skills and knowledge people need to perform. But we also have to understand the constraints. So what are the challenges in their environment? How do they feel about having to learn those things? What do they stand to gain? So you think about pain and gain. You think also about, well, what do they have to do and what might be the roadblocks there? Environmental, psychological, whatever they are. So those really take a holistic view. And then the prototyping, boy, it's so great because it takes all the pressure off needing to come up with perfection. Is you put something together quickly after limited information, and then you let your business partner give you feedback on that. And then you go back and fix some things, give it to them again, and they'll say, oh, I like this, nope, don't like that. Go back and iterate, and you get to an answer much, much quicker.
Peter, I don't know if you just saw
I
don't know if you saw there's a question from Danielle. Yep, the empathy map, and then there's one down here from Danielle around what scenarios would you advocate for traditional classroom training? And I just think this is an important question because it's probably one that most learning professionals struggle with, is where is the line and what is the place of classroom training in my world today?
Yes, okay, it's a great question, Danielle. The short answer is I would say the scenarios for classroom training are learning how to fish. So if you think of the old saying, don't give a person a dinner, teach them how to fish and they'll fish for life. Focus on helping them find the answers in the job. So we did this with a client who was rolling out Office 365. People had to learn, all these new Outlook functionalities and things like that. And we used a performance support tool, and we focused the classroom time on one, navigation, just click around, get oriented to the interface. And then second, we're going to throw out challenge after scenario, say, go find this. How would you do this? How would you do that? And then people had to use the performance support tool to find the answers to fish during the classroom, and we could help them and guide them how to do that. And what we measured is their confidence coming out of the classroom, and their competence weeks after was much higher because they had already fumbled and failed in that safe environment. But they knew the tool they had to use. But here's a twist on that I'll throw out, Danielle. I actually talked about this with a client 2 weeks ago, and I said, well, what do you think of this idea, teach people how to fish? He said, oh, I think it's great, but what if what's needed is how to hunt? In this 21st century world where the conditions are changing, what if you actually have to learn a whole different game? And I said, wow, what a great idea. And that brings us back to our third, tenet of the concept of learning how to learn. You may have learned how to fish, but now you have to hunt. You better know how to learn hunting quickly and deeply. So that's what I would say in terms of classroom scenarios. And I totally am glad you believe in empathy maps. I definitely think that human-centered design is blending with learning design right now. In terms of empathy maps, Virginia, you can honestly Google it and then go to Google Images. You'll find a ton of them. I would always argue, given I'm a lean learning fan, that less is more. Pick the simple ones that are easy, intuitive. Oh, and it looks like Anne is sharing one already. Fantastic.
So Peter, I know
okay.
You had one last slide to cover in your content, and we're running close on time, so I want to make sure we get to that final slide and provide some wrap up here.
Yeah, so this is just a really provocative quote that I think ties to our fishing and hunting. The illiterate of the 21st century won't be the person who cannot read. It will be the person who does not know how to learn. This is Alvin Toffler, who just died recently. He wrote The Third Wave back in the 1970s. He's a really well-known futurist, well-respected. And I think this is a great concept to finish on. Learning how to learn is the master skill. It is the stem cell of kind of performance and success going forward. Yes, AI is going to come and grow. Yes, it's going to take some parts of our jobs away. What does that mean for us? It means we have to then learn the next thing. So really honing and learning how to learn is a really area of focus. And it's an exciting time to be in learning because of all the science. We know how to help people learn better. We have practices, we have better tools, and we have a better community. So I think it's a real opportunity right now. And I think to the point about the business is starting to recognize this. I have a client right now, CEO of a multinational pharma company, and he's saying that our number one competitive advantage is learning. that is what is going to differentiate us. Quality is a commodity now. Like, we know how to make stuff pretty good, but working together to adapt to something new and learn something new, we're not so good at that yet. But those who can will pull ahead of the pack.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for today. It has been a great session. I think the folks who joined the webinar really enjoyed it. It was great interactivity. I would highly encourage everyone who hasn't had a chance yet to get the chance to connect with Peter. You have his email address right there. And, of course, you can connect with the folks at Slalom Chicago, at Slalom Chicago on your Twitter feed, and slalom.com for website. So, Peter, again, thank you so much for today's content. Thank you to everyone who joined. I think this was a great conversation about lean learning. I think it was a great conversation about how to change the conversation with your business partner, how to really embrace them to embrace that learning goes everywhere. I'm glad everyone enjoyed it. I'll encourage everyone to be on the lookout for our next invite. We'll have Bob Mosier joining us from Applied Synergies, talking about that 70-20-10 principle. You'll see invites coming up. We'll be putting Peter's webinar out there. We'll distribute it out to everyone else. We'll obviously put it out on our social media feeds. And again, thank you, Peter. Thanks to Slalom Consulting for partnering with us, and thanks for everybody to attending today. Everybody have a great rest of your day and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, everyone.